Okay, we're now going to take a look at part two of our intro to the Civil War. And specifically, I thought in the beginning we would focus on the men who did the fighting, the average soldier. What was he like? What was he made of? Uh, and what were his contributions? So let's take a look at the Civil War, part two. Keeping in mind that as we as we get into this, uh, the reasons for fighting vary from man to man. When Lincoln starts out, he asks for 75,000 volunteers, gets over 200,000, and neither he nor the government were quite ready to deal with those numbers. The South is similar in the reaction of its populace in terms of the war's popularity. And of course, everybody thought that this would be one and done. So, Civil War basics. United States has 22 million people, 2 million of which will enlist in the Army. Now, keep in mind, they had 4 million who were military eligible, so 50% of the population. Whereas the Confederate States, they have a total population of 9 million and only 850,000 enlist. Yet, that's 80% of those who were eligible to enlist did so. 750,000 dead. And that number actually keeps growing as we uncover more and more evidence. As you see there on the screen, 2% of the entire population killed in the war. If that same war were fought today with the exact same percentages, we're talking in the neighborhood of 20 million. So as you can tell, everybody, man, woman, and child on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line were impacted by this war in one way or another. You see there two pictures of the typical enlisted man. On the left, Private Ira Fish. As you can tell, typical height is like 5'6", 5'7". His gun and his bayonet are taller than he is. On the right, you have the Confederate Private Sampson Altman. Altman, as you see there at the bottom, died in April 1863 from disease. And more soldiers died from disease than they did from bullets and cannons. More men died of diarrhea than they did from fighting on the battlefield. So obviously, cleanliness, disease were topics that were not yet to the point that we have today. Typical soldier, 5'7", anywhere from 10 to 80 years old. They carried huge weights on their back. They wore wool uniforms. Summer, winter, didn't make any difference. And they walked in brogans. Brogans was the type of shoe that existed back then. One size fit all. And there was no such thing as a left or right shoe. Production had not geared up to the point where it could produce that type of thing. Now, eventually they would, but not in the beginning. So the brogans, though leather made, extremely uncomfortable. But at least the North had shoes. It was not necessarily the case in many of the Southern soldiers. The Northern Army, as you see there, prior to the Battle of Gettysburg, which was in July of 1863, walked on an average of 20 miles a day. That's in those uniforms carrying that weight. And most of the war, the majority of the men in both armies were volunteers. $13 a month. If you were black, you got $8 a month. More about that later. But as you can see, you were given a bonus to join. And this was extremely attractive to men. Then later on, when the draft was instituted on both sides would allow people to hire substitutes. So in other words, I would pay you $50 to take my place. Perfectly legal. Of course, it became a scam because what would happen is these subs would take your 50, go in, get the $300 bonus to join up, then turn around, walk out the back door, and then sell themselves to somebody else. So they were making out rather well. Eventually, of course, they probably would wind up in the Army, but they did not make the same solid soldiers that the original people who had wanted to come in the Army, the volunteers. That's why the phrase rich man's war, poor man's fight originated, particularly down south, because the average person could not afford to pay the $50 to get somebody to take their place. So particularly immigrants first arriving, automatically drafted and didn't have much recourse. Now, you can see where many of these people came from. Majority of the Union soldiers were native born. Those who were not, the Germans topped the list. As you see there, people from all over the world, and over 1,000 women disguised themselves as men and fought in the armies on both sides. But take a look at 4 out of every 9 Confederates owned slaves or lived in a household with slaves connected to the slave system. So a lot of people involved in the war, despite what Confederate myth holds up, were somehow involved in some way, shape, or form with slavery. As you can see, when the Confederates invaded Pennsylvania, leading to the Battle of Gettysburg, they brought with them 3,000 slaves. 3,000. And they provided tremendous military advantage in that they freed more men up for fighting and could construct and serve at the same time. Now, I point out the guns of the Civil War because they're going to make a tremendous difference in how this war is going to be fought. Take a look, first of all, at the bottom right-hand corner. You see a typical musket ball there on the left, and on the right, that's called a mini ball. And if you pay close attention to that one on the right, that is going to change the way the war is going to be fought. You see here the grooves in the bullet. Those grooves allowed it to fit inside of a barrel that had a rifling in it. That meant that there were circular motions or circular grooves all the way through the barrel. This allowed it to come out faster, straighter, and increase the distance. The ball there on the left-hand side, effective range of about 75 yards. The mini ball on the right-hand side, effective range of anywhere, depending on the barrel, of 500 to maybe 700 yards. So again, big difference. And what would happen with this, the old style tactics, which went with old style weaponry, had men marching together, shoulder to shoulder, closed formation, because their guns were so inaccurate, they would fire all together, hoping to hit something. Well, still in that pack formation, now they could be shot at from 500 yards away with deadly accuracy. So the slaughter increased over previous wars. So they were still using old style tactics while experiencing new weaponry. Take a look at the very top here at the different cannon shells that are used. Same principle applied. Some of these would be rifled at the bottom. Again, shoot further, faster, and much more accurate. Some of these exploded on contact. Some of them, like the cannonball, just bounced and could wipe out entire lines of men. Some of them had shrapnel in them and exploded in the air over top of a line. So the cannons were a brutal way of exacting tremendous results. Some of these were canisters. Canisters really were, think of them as coffee cans, packed with pieces of metal or maybe musket balls. They be fired out with an effective range of approximately 100 yards and could rip holes through any line coming through. And if you got closer, then sometimes it would be double or triple canister, making, of course, the cannons a giant shotgun. Now we're going to skip over this, all right? The artillery, we just covered. Now, cavalry, one of the glorious branches of service from Napoleonic days. But unfortunately, this wasn't Napoleonic days anymore. These horses make great targets. Again, cavalry, the idea was to charge using the horses to intimidate people, because if I can only fire 75 yards away, I might get one shot off before they're over me. But now, with 500 yards away, I might get 3-4 shots in. And so the cavalry ceased to be an effective military agent in the way that Napoleon used them. Now they provided scouting or screening, stopping other scouts from getting in and seeing the army. They were the eyes and ears of the army that was marching. This just is statistics from the Battle of Gettysburg. 87,000 horses and mules there that day. Now, take a look. On a daily basis, they needed 1 million pounds of grain, 1 million pounds of hay, and 800,000 gallons of water per day. That's per day. And when it was all done, it came out. So you got 1 million pounds of manure and 150,000 gallons of urine per day all over the place. Combine that with the fact that they were there for 3 days. Now put the dead bodies lying all over the place, both man and horse or mule, and you can imagine the stench that was created. Lee's army itself had over 1,000 ambulances and 5,000 wagons, and their line of march 15 miles long. Right around 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, we know that right after the issuance of the proclamation, Lincoln advocated the formation of African American units. And so it was. The most famous, of course, would be the 54th Massachusetts, that would gain fame and glory, as the movie would later show, at the Battle of Fort Wagner, which is right outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Almost 180,000 African Americans would serve in the Army. And again, quite a few would also serve in the Navy. Ironically, just as in the American Revolution, the American Navy had no problem in bringing in African Americans from the beginning of the war. That was not the case in the Army. And it was Lincoln who pushed it. And there's a great deal that goes with it. If you've ever seen Glory, then you understand what I'm talking about. Well, maybe we won't see this either. Now, Civil War tactics. What you see there are the blue and gray blocks. They were regiments of men, brigades of men, again, all packed together. Generally speaking, they were all from the same area, maybe even the same town. And there was a method to that madness. The reason being, they felt they would fight better together. They were less likely to run because you didn't want to become a coward in front of your neighbor, your relative, your townsman. So that was one reason for putting them together. The other was this idea: you had a line of battle, and lines of battle were typical of that day. And again, you'd march straight across at one another in open fields, pounding away. But the general idea was to try to get around the flank of the army. If you could get around the edge and then roll up his line, you were going to win. Even better if you could get behind them and get in, behind their lines, complete chaos would result. So every time you're talking about getting around the left flank, getting around the right flank. Rarely, though, we'll take a look at it a couple times, did they come right up the middle. First major battle of the war would be the Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861. Now, this is only 35 miles outside of Washington, D.C. And the commanding general of the Union forces kept trying to tell Lincoln, these guys are just not ready yet. Lincoln, as you see there, said, "You're green, they're green, get out there." Because Lincoln knew that most of these men who had signed up had only signed up for a few months. So he wasn't going to have them very long. So again, many people predicted that this would be a one and done battle, one and done war. So the Battle of Bull Run, and the man who gains fame from that battle more than anybody else would be the man you see pictured there, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Because just as it looked like the South was going to lose, Jackson rallies his men to stand and fight. Other troops who were fleeing turned and heard one general say, "Look, men, there's Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally to the Virginians." So forevermore, he would be known as Stonewall Jackson and his men as the Stone. He would ride around sucking on a lemon, tells you something, and holding his offhand up in the air. During this battle, he actually gets shot in that hand, but doesn't stop him from sucking on that. He is going to become the best battlefield general under Robert E. Lee during the war. Unfortunately, he will be shot by his own men by mistake and will die a couple of weeks after their greatest victory, the Confederates, that is, the Battle of Chancellorsville.
It was a hot Sunday, July 1861. Expecting the Union troops to crush the rebel forces, politicians and other Washingtonians traveled to the battle site for a picnic and a quick victory. 20,000 Confederate troops under the command of the experienced General P.G.T. Beauregard waited for the approaching Union troops. The Union artillery sent the first shot across Bull Run. A battle of confusion and chaos was underway. Led by the inexperienced General Irvin McDowell, the 32,000 Yankees successfully hammered the rebel troops. McDowell called out, "Victory! Victory! The day is ours!" But as the day wore on, more and more Confederate troops had arrived at the center of the battle. By 3:30 p.m., 20,000 Confederate troops under General Stonewall Jackson prepared to attack the Union troops.
Hold your fire, boys, until they are on you. Then fire. Give them the bayonet. And when you charge, yell like furies.
As the Confederate troops surged forward at the Union forces, they gave out a strange and eerie battle cry that would come to be known as the Rebel Yell. Within 15 minutes, massive chaos broke out among the Union line. Thousands of Union soldiers threw down their weapons and packs. Union troops began to scatter everywhere and run for their lives. The bold rebels managed to turn the tide of the battle to their favor. By nightfall, what was left of McDowell's Union army, plus the thousands of terrified onlookers, were all fleeing headlong back to Washington. With 2,708 Union and 1,982 Confederate troops killed, wounded, and missing, the First Battle of Bull Run was then the largest and bloodiest battle in U.S. history. But the worst was yet to come.
Now, one of the ironies of the war is, again, if Jackson's men had not been so exhausted and were spread out all over the place, they probably literally could have marched right into Washington, D.C., and it would have been a one-and-done war. But after this particular battle, both sides realized that they were in it for the long haul, whatever that would be. This particular battle revealed a couple of things. First of all, first time they fought, and there was a mishmash of uniforms. So you had some guys for the Union wearing gray, some guys for the Confederates wearing blue, and it caused some massive mistakes, and you had a lot of people killed by what's called friendly fire. By the same token, the other difficulties that existed was the use of the railroad train. Because there was a direct line into Manassas for the Confederates, that's how they were able to bring up reinforcements quickly from all over the place. Now this is one of the rare times when they could use their railroad transportation system to do this. But nevertheless, it pointed out the value of the railroads. Also, you're going to find during this particular battle, the Northern troops are marching through the fields, and they had to yell at the picketers to get out of the way. Nobody appreciated what was going to take place at this particular battle. Also, what you have here, typical North and South. And what I mean by that is you're going to find that every battle that the South fights, they call it by the closest town. So this was the Battle of Manassas. A year later, there would be another battle, and they would call it Second Manassas. For the North, they usually called it by the closest body of water. So that's why they called it Bull Run. There was a stream there called Bull Run. There would be a second Bull Run. So they could not even agree on the names of battles. So this was now, for better or for worse, a war of brother against brother. What you're going to find here, a slaughter that none of them were ready for. Battle of Antietam, which lasted only 7 hours, 25,000 casualties. That's more in 7 hours than all of America's previous wars combined. Think about that. In just 7 hours. Average age of the fighters was 23 years old. And this was going to be what's known as total war. That means two things. One, there would be no safe haven. Eventually, civilians would be made to suffer, as war was declared on a side, not just on an army. And secondly, as you see there, whoever won, it meant that their system of government, of life, would be what was going to be the norm, what everybody was going to have to follow. This is from the movie Gettysburg. It's Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, the leader of the 20th Maine. Chamberlain had been a college professor before he took this post. We're getting ready to go into Gettysburg. Chamberlain will be called the hero, the savior of Gettysburg. Chamberlain is about to address 100 men from Maine who are being charged as deserters. They're claiming that they had signed up for a certain length of period of time, their time was up, and they were going home. Lincoln, in order to keep men in the Army, had to automatically extend everybody's enlistments, and these gentlemen, among many others, felt that this was a violation of the contract that they had signed. So this is Chamberlain addressing them, saying that they had been turned over to him and the 20th Maine and what they were going to do. But I wanted to play this segment so you can answer the question, why do men fight? Listen.
Gather round. I've been talking with Private Buckland. He's told me about your problem. There's nothing I can do today. We're moving out in a few minutes. We'll be moving all day. I've been ordered to take you men with me. I'm told that that if you don't come, I can shoot you. Well, you know I won't do that. Maybe somebody else will, but I won't. So, that's that. Here's the situation. The whole Reb Army is up that road a ways waiting for us, so this is no time for an argument like this. I tell you, we could surely use you fellas. We're now well below half strength. Whether you fight or not, that's up to you. Whether you come along is well, you're coming. You know who we are, what we're doing here, but if you're going to fight alongside us, there's a few things I want you to know. This regiment was formed last summer in Maine. There were 1,000 of us then. There are less than 300 of us now. All of us volunteered to fight for the Union, just as you did. Some came mainly because we were bored at home. Thought this looked like it might be fun. Some came because we were ashamed not to. Many of us came because it was the right thing to do. And all of us have seen men die. This is a different kind of army. If you look back through history, you will see men fighting for pay, for women, for some other kind of loot. They fight for land, power. Because a king leads them, or just because they like killing. We are here for something new. This has not happened much in the history of the world. We are an army out to set other men free. America should be free ground. All of it. Not divided by a line between slave state and free. All the way. From here to the Pacific Ocean. No man has to bow. No man born to royalty. Here we judge you by what you do, not by who your father was. Here you can be something. Here is the place to build a home. But it's not the land. There's always more land. It's the idea that we all have value. You and me. What we're fighting for
In the end, we're fighting for each other. Sorry, I didn't mean to preach. You go ahead. You talk for a while. If you choose to join us, you want your muskets back, you can have them. Nothing more will be said by anybody anywhere. If you choose not to join us, well, you can come along under guard, and when this is all over, I will do what I can to see you get a fair treatment, but for now, we're moving out. Gentlemen, I think if we lose this fight, we lose the war. So if you choose to join us, I'll be personally very grateful.
Colonel, sir. It's a fine morning.
Have some spare? Are we ready?
Sir, that we are.
Well, then let's move out.
20th Maine! Forward! March!
So what were they fighting for? For the North, this vague notion of union, that nobody could leave. We had formed a bond that could not be broken, and for social change, namely the Emancipation Proclamation. For the Confederacy, they're fighting for their homes and for their independence. That's the way they looked at it. And of course, bottom line, a way of life that included slavery.
Long-growing tensions between the North and South over the issue of slavery erupted into the Civil War in 1861. In late 1860 and early 1861, 7 southern states seceded from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, after federal forces refused to turn it over to South Carolina's troops. War had begun. The day after Fort Sumter's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln called for the remaining states in the Union to send troops to put down the rebellion in the southern states. Soon, men on both sides eagerly signed up to fight. Early on, people believed that the war would end quickly. Spectators even packed picnic meals to watch the first major fight of the war, the Battle of Bull Run. But the Civil War was unlike any previous conflict. It was the world's first industrial war. Mass-produced weapons and trench warfare resulted in huge losses on both sides. The destruction of homes and farms brought the war home to civilians. The struggle proved anything but quick. At first, the South more than held its own against the North. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had great success against the Union early in the war. Many Southerners felt that if the South could hold on long enough, people in the North would eventually lose the will to fight and let the Confederate States go. But on January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln made a dramatic change in the war. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation made slavery illegal in the 11 rebelling southern states, seen here in light gray. although it left slavery in place in the dark blue border states, which had stayed loyal to the Union. Lincoln's proclamation shifted the emphasis of the war. Now it was more than a fight to keep the nation together. It was also a struggle to free the slaves. Eventually, the North's larger population and greater industrial power overcame the South. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Other Southern armies also surrendered, and the war was over. The North's victory came at a huge cost, though. The Civil War had raged for 4 long and bloody years. Much of the South lay in ruins. Countless families lost their homes, and more than 600,000 soldiers had died. More than the American losses in World War I and II, Korea, and Vietnam put together. But after the smoke cleared and the dead were buried, the Union was preserved. The authority of the federal government was solidified, and slavery was ended.
We will take a look at the last few days of the Civil War in our next and, of course, our last lecture, and I will put that up sometime tomorrow. I hope you have a great day, and take care.